The deed of mercy. The dust kicked up by wagon wheels and restless hooves hung in the air like a brown shroud over Bitter Creek's makeshift auction square. Thomas Whitmore stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands gripping the brim of his hat as he watched the proceedings with growing disgust. The sun beat down mercilessly on the assembled men, their faces flushed red from whiskey and the August heat, their voices rising in cruel competition as they bid on livestock and property. He'd come to town for supplies, nothing more. His ranch sat 20 miles north of this god-forsaken settlement, and he rarely had cause to venture into civilization. But Martha's store had run short of ammunition, and with winter approaching, he needed to stock up before the mountain passes became impassable. Now he wished he'd never left the quiet sanctuary of his land. "Next lot," bellowed Silas Crane, the auctioneer, whose voice carried the authority of a man who'd grown rich off others' misfortune. One healthy mule, excellent for farm work, and one girl, approximately 16 years, suitable for domestic service. Thomas felt his stomach turn as a gaunt bay mule was led into the clearing, its ribs showing through dull coat, followed by a slight figure in a torn cotton dress. The girl kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her dark hair hanging like a curtain around her face. Even from his position at the back of the crowd, Thomas could see she was trembling. "Now hold on there, Crane," called out Jake Morrison, a local merchant with more money than sense. "That mule looks half dead. What's wrong with it?" Crane shrugged, his thick mustache twitching with amusement. "Nothing a few good meals won't cure. Been working hard is all. As for the girl, she's strong as an ox and quiet as a church mouse. Came from the wagon train that got hit by Comanche last month. Only survivor." Thomas's jaw clenched. He'd heard about that massacre. 47 souls lost, including women and children. The fact that this girl had survived only to end up on an auction block was an injustice that burned in his chest like swallowed coals. "I'll start the bidding at $50 for the pair," Crane announced. "50," shouted Morrison immediately. "60," came another voice. 75. Thomas watched the girl's shoulders shake with each increase in price. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who deserved better than to be sold like cattle to the highest bidder. The mule, meanwhile, swayed on its feet, clearly suffering from malnutrition and exhaustion. $100, Morrison called out, his voice confident. Several other bidders dropped out at that price, leaving only two competitors. $125, countered Bill Huskins, a rancher known for his harsh treatment of hired hands. Thomas had heard stories about Huskins' place. Men worked to death, women who disappeared in the night, debts that somehow never got paid despite years of labor. The thought of that innocent girl ending up in Huskins' hands made his blood run cold. $150. Morrison bid again, sweat beading on his forehead despite his bravado. Huskins hesitated, calculating the worth of his investment. $175. The crowd murmured with excitement. It was more money than most of them saw in 6 months. Crane grinned like a wolf, sensing the profit to be made. Thomas looked down at the leather satchel tucked inside his coat pocket. Inside was his most precious possession, the deed to his ranch. 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, water rights, timber rights, everything he'd worked for during 15 years of back-breaking labor. He'd bought it fair and square from old Pete Sullivan before the man died, paying in gold earned from 3 seasons of buffalo hunting in dangerous territory. That land was his whole world, his sanctuary, his future. Without it, he'd be just another drifter with nothing but the clothes on his back and the horse beneath him. $175 going once. Crane called out, his gavel raised. The girl lifted her head slightly, and Thomas caught a glimpse of her face. She couldn't have been more than 16, with delicate features and eyes that held depths of trauma no child should ever know. In that brief moment, their gazes met across the dusty square, and he saw something there that broke his heart. Not fear, but resignation. She'd given up hope entirely, going twice. Thomas stepped forward, his hand moving to his coat pocket. $2,000. The crowd fell silent. Even Crane's gavel froze mid-swing. $2,000 was more money than most of these men had ever seen in their lives. It was enough to buy half the town. "Did you say 2,000? Crane asked, his voice cracking slightly. "You heard me right." Thomas pulled out his deed and held it up for all to see. "I'll trade this here land deed for the girl and the mule. 2,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory, with water rights and timber rights included." The silence stretched on as every man in the square stared at him in disbelief. Morrison's mouth hung open like a landed fish. Even Huskins looked stunned. That's a hell of an offer, stranger," Crane said slowly. "But how do I know that deed's legitimate?" "Because Pete Sullivan signed it in front of Judge Henderson 3 years ago, and it's been recorded at the territorial office in Denver. You can verify it yourself." Thomas stepped closer to the platform, his steady gaze never leaving Crane's face. "Do we have a deal?" Crane's eyes glittered with greed as he examined the deed. After several minutes of scrutiny, he nodded slowly. "We have a deal." The crowd erupted in confused murmurs as Thomas climbed onto the platform. He handed over the deed with steady hands, though inside his heart was breaking. With that single piece of paper went everything he'd built, everything he'd planned, everything he'd dreamed of for his future. But when he looked at the girl again, saw the disbelief and gratitude beginning to dawn in her eyes, he knew he'd made the right choice. "Come on," he said gently, offering her his arm. "Let's get you out of here." She hesitated for a moment, then took his arm with trembling fingers. Together they walked down from the platform, Thomas leading the sick mule behind them. The crowd parted like water before them, men stepping aside to let them pass in stunned silence. It wasn't until they reached the edge of town that the girl finally spoke. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of their footsteps. Thomas considered the question as they walked toward where he'd tied his horse. It was a good question, one he'd been asking himself ever since the words had left his mouth. Why had he given up everything for a stranger? Why had he sacrificed his entire future for a girl whose name he didn't even know? "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "Because everyone deserves to be free. Because that land never would have felt like home if I'd bought it with someone else's suffering." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and he saw tears beginning to form in her dark eyes. "What's your name?" "Thomas Whitmore." "What's yours?" "Elena. Elena Rodriguez." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "My family, they were traveling to California to start a farm. We'd saved for years to make the journey." "I'm sorry for your loss," Thomas said quietly. "I truly am." They walked in silence for a while, the sick mule plodding slowly behind them. When they reached Thomas's horse, he helped Elena up into the saddle before climbing up behind her. The mule would have to walk, but Thomas could see it needed rest and care more than anything else. "Where are we going?" Elena asked as they started north out of town. "I don't rightly know," Thomas admitted. "I had a ranch about 20 miles from here, but it belongs to Crane now. I suppose we'll have to figure something else out." "You gave up your ranch for me," she said, her voice full of wonder. "You gave up your home." "A home ain't worth much if you can't live with yourself in it," Thomas replied. "Besides, land is just dirt and rocks. It's the people who make a place worth caring about." As they rode through the afternoon, Elena told him about her family's journey and the terrible night when the Comanche had attacked their wagon train. She spoke of her parents, her younger brother, the dreams they'd all shared of building a new life in California. Thomas listened without judgment, offering comfort when her voice broke, and patience when she needed time to collect herself. In return, he told her about his own past, the years of hunting buffalo in dangerous territory, the careful saving of every penny, the pride he'd felt when he'd finally saved enough to buy Pete Sullivan's ranch. He'd planned to raise cattle, maybe start a family someday, build something lasting and good. "Do you regret it?" Elena asked as the sun began to set behind the mountains. "Giving up your ranch for someone you don't even know?" Thomas considered the question serious. He thought about the years of work that deed represented, the dreams that had gone with it, the uncertain future that lay ahead. Then he looked at the young woman riding in front of him, alive and free because of his choice, and felt a peace settle over him that he'd never experienced before. "No," he said firmly, "I don't regret it at all." They made camp that night beside a small stream, using Thomas's bedroll and the few supplies he'd brought for his journey to town. The mule grazed carefully on the sparse grass, its condition already seeming to improve with rest and access to fresh water. "What will you do now?" Elena asked as they sat by their small fire, sharing a meal of beans and hardtack. "I've got some money saved up in the bank in Denver," Thomas said. "Not much, but enough to get by for a while. Maybe I'll find work as a ranch hand, save up enough to try again somewhere else. And me?" Elena's voice was small, uncertain. Thomas looked at her across the flickering flames. "That's up to you. You're free now, truly free. You can go anywhere you want, do anything you choose. If you want to continue on to California like your family planned, I'll help you get there. If you want to go back east to relatives, I'll make sure you have safe passage. Whatever you decide, I'll do everything I can to help." Elena stared into the fire for a long time, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I don't have any relatives back east," she said finally. "And California, it doesn't feel right going there without my family. I wouldn't know what to do with myself." "You could stay here in the territory," Thomas suggested. "There are decent towns where a young woman with good sense could make her way. You could teach school, or work in a shop, or—" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat, but he forced himself to think carefully before answering. "Elena," he said gently, "you've been through more trauma than anyone should have to bear. Right now you're grateful to me for helping you. But that's not the same as, well, it's not the same as really choosing to be with someone. You need time to heal. Time to figure out who you are when you're not running from danger or grief." "I know the difference between gratitude and something deeper," Elena said quietly. "And I know that in that square today, when our eyes met, I felt something I've never felt before. Not because you saved me, but because of who you are. The kind of man who would give up everything for a stranger's freedom." Thomas felt warmth spread through his chest, but he shook his head firmly. "Even so, you need time. You need to know you have choices, real choices, before you make any decisions about your future." Elena smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "You're a good man, Thomas Whitmore, probably too good for your own good." "We'll see about that," Thomas replied with a chuckle. They spent the next week traveling slowly north, partly to accommodate the recovering mule and partly because neither of them was in any hurry to reach their uncertain destination. Each day brought new conversations, shared stories, and a growing understanding between them. Thomas learned that Elena had been educated by her mother, who had been a teacher before marriage. She could read and write better than most men, had a quick mind for figures, and possessed a keen understanding of human nature that came from observing her parents' successful marriage. Elena learned that beneath Thomas's gruff exterior lay a man of deep principles and surprising gentleness. He had never married because he'd never found a woman who shared his values, and he'd spent so many years in the wilderness that he sometimes forgot how to make conversation with civilized folk. "Why didn't you ever settle down before?" Elena asked one evening as they made camp beside a clear mountain lake. "Never found the right woman, I suppose," Thomas said, unsaddling his horse with practiced efficiency. "Most of the women I met wanted a man who could provide them with fancy dresses and a house in town. I always knew I was meant for simpler things, wide open spaces, honest work, maybe a cabin in the mountains where a man could think his own thoughts." And Thomas looked at her over his horse's back, taking in her simple beauty and the strength that had carried her through unimaginable hardship. "Now I'm starting to think maybe I was looking in the wrong places." On their 8th day of travel, they encountered a small wagon train heading west. The wagon master, a grizzled veteran named Captain Morrison, took one look at Elena and immediately offered his protection for the remainder of her journey to California. "We've got good families traveling with us," Morrison assured Thomas. "The Hendersons have daughters about her age, and Mrs. Patterson could use help with her youngsters. The girl would be safe with us, and we'd see her settled proper once we reach Sacramento." It was exactly the kind of opportunity Thomas had hoped Elena would have, a chance to continue her family's dream, to start fresh in a place where no one knew her tragic history. He watched her face carefully as Morrison made his offer, trying to read her thoughts. "That's very generous of you, Captain," Elena said politely. "Could I have some time to think it over?" "Of course, miss. We'll be camped here tonight and pulling out at dawn. You let me know before that." That evening, Elena sat by their fire in thoughtful silence, while Thomas tended to the mule, which had improved dramatically over the past week. Its coat was beginning to shine, its ribs no longer showed, and it had regained much of its strength. "You should go with them," Thomas said finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. Elena looked up at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter. What matters is what's best for you. And you think going to California is what's best for me?" Thomas sat down across from her, his hands clasped loosely between his knees. "I think you deserve every opportunity to build the life you want. With Morrison's train, you'd have protection, companionship, and the chance to fulfill your family's dream. That seems like a pretty good opportunity to me. And what about us?" The simple question hit Thomas like a physical blow. Over the past week, he'd tried to ignore the growing connection between them, told himself it was just proximity and shared trauma creating false intimacy. But sitting here now, facing the possibility of losing her, he couldn't deny the truth any longer. "There is no us," he said gently. "There's a man who gave up his future in a moment of righteous anger, and a young woman who's grateful to him for it. That's not enough to build a life on." Elena stood up abruptly and walked to the edge of their camp, staring out at the star-filled sky. Thomas watched her silhouette against the darkness, memorizing every detail because he was beginning to realize he might never see her again. "You're wrong," she said finally, without turning around. "There's a man who saw injustice and chose to act, regardless of the cost to himself. There's a woman who recognizes strength and goodness when she sees it. There's two people who've shared more honest conversation in 8 days than most folks share in 8 years. She turned back to face him then, and he could see tears glistening on her cheeks in the firelight. There's two people who've found something rare and precious in the middle of terrible circumstances, she continued. And one of them is too noble for his own good, and the other is trying to figure out how to convince him that some things are worth fighting for. Thomas felt his resolve wavering. Everything in him wanted to tell her to stay, to throw caution to the wind, and see what they might build together. But his conscience wouldn't let him take advantage of her vulnerability. "Elena," he said softly, "you're barely 16 years old. You've lost everything and everyone you ever loved. Right now I represent safety and kindness in a world that's shown you nothing but cruelty. But that's not love. That's trauma bonding. You need time to heal. Time to grow, time to discover who you are when you're not running from tragedy." "And how much time would be enough?" Elena asked, stepping closer to the fire. "A year? 5 years? 10? How long before you'd believe that my feelings are real?" Thomas didn't have an answer for that. The truth was, he'd begun to care for her more deeply than he'd ever cared for anyone. But his honor wouldn't let him take advantage of someone so young and vulnerable. "I don't know," he admitted finally. Elena nodded slowly, as if his honesty had settled something in her mind. "Then I'll go with Morrison's train," she said quietly. "But not to California." "What do you mean?" "I'll travel with them as far as Denver. It's safer than traveling alone, and I can earn my keep helping with the children. Once I reach Denver, I'll find work and make my own way for a while." Thomas felt a mixture of relief and disappointment wash over him. Denver was only a day's ride from where his ranch had been. It would be close enough to keep an eye on her, to help if she needed it, but far enough to give her the space she needed to grow and heal. "That sounds like a wise plan," he said, though the words felt like ashes in his mouth. "Will you visit me?"
Elena asked softly. If you want me to. I want you to, she said firmly. And Thomas? Yes. 2 years. Give me 2 years to prove that my feelings are real, that I know my own mind, that I can build a life on my own terms. If you still think I'm just a traumatized girl clinging to her rescuer after 2 years of independence, then I'll accept that and move on. Thomas looked at her standing there in the firelight, so young and yet so determined, and felt something shift in his chest. Maybe she was right. Maybe 2 years would be enough time for both of them to know their own hearts. 2 years, he agreed. The next morning, Elena joined Morrison's wagon train with mixed emotions. Thomas helped her gather her few possessions and introduced her to the Henderson family, who welcomed her warmly and promised to look after her on the journey to Denver. As the wagons pulled out, Elena looked back at Thomas one last time. He sat astride his horse, the recovered mule tied behind him, watching the train disappear into the distance. She raised her hand in farewell, and he touched the brim of his hat in response. After the wagons were gone, Thomas sat alone for a long time, thinking about the past 2 weeks and the uncertain future ahead. He'd given up everything he'd worked for, but somehow he didn't feel empty. Instead, he felt as though he'd gained something far more valuable than land or cattle or buildings. He'd gained purpose. The next 2 years passed slowly for both of them. Thomas found work as a ranch foreman for a decent man named Colonel Davies, whose spread lay about 30 miles east of Denver. The work was hard but fair, and Davies appreciated Thomas's experience and integrity enough to pay him well and treat him with respect. Every few months, Thomas would ride into Denver to check on Elena. She'd found work as a teacher at a small school and had rented a modest room above a bakery. True to her word, she was building an independent life for herself, making friends, contributing to her community, and growing into the confident young woman Thomas had always sensed she could become. Their visits were carefully proper. Afternoon tea in the hotel lobby, walks through the town square with other people around, conversations that anyone could overhear. Thomas was determined not to compromise her reputation or put any pressure on her to make a decision about their future. But as the months passed, he found himself counting the days between visits, treasuring every letter she wrote, and lying awake at night, thinking about her smile. Elena, meanwhile, threw herself into her new life with determination. She taught children to read and write, helped their families with correspondence and bookkeeping, and slowly built a reputation as a capable and trustworthy young woman. But no amount of activity could distract her from the loneliness she felt, or the way her heart raced every time Thomas appeared in town. As their 2-year agreement neared its end, both of them grew increasingly nervous about what would happen next. Would Thomas still think she was too young? Would Elena have discovered that her feelings had been based on gratitude rather than love? The answer came on a crisp October morning when Thomas arrived in Denver to find Elena waiting for him outside the school, a letter clutched in her trembling hand. "Thomas," she said breathlessly, "I have news. Good news, I hope." Elena's face broke into a radiant smile. "The territorial government is offering land grants to settlers willing to establish schools in remote areas. I could claim 160 acres and receive funding to build a schoolhouse. I could have my own land, my own school, my own future." Thomas felt his heart sink. "That's wonderful, Elena. Where would this land be?" "Anywhere I choose within the territory. I could pick a valley near a growing town, or a spot along a main trail, or..." She paused, looking up at him with eyes that sparkled with mischief. "Or I could choose a section adjacent to a certain ranch that I've heard might be coming up for sale soon." Thomas stared at her in confusion. "What ranch?" "Your ranch, Thomas. Your old ranch. Silas Crane has been trying to make a go of it for 2 years, but he's a businessman, not a rancher. Word is he's ready to sell for half what he paid for it. Colonel Davies mentioned it last week when he was in town." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "You've been talking to Colonel Davies?" "I've been talking to anyone who would listen about land prices, cattle markets and ranch properties in the area," Elena said firmly. "I've spent 2 years learning to be independent, just like you wanted. Now I'm ready to be independently wealthy." "Elena, what are you saying?" She stepped closer to him, her dark eyes serious now. "I'm saying that 2 years have passed. I'm 18 years old. I have my own money, my own career, and my own plans for the future. I know exactly who I am and what I want. And what do you want? I want to marry a stubborn, noble, impossible man who once gave up everything he owned to save a stranger. I want to build a school that serves ranch families scattered across miles of beautiful country. I want to raise children who know the value of both education and hard work, and I want to do it all on land that we own together. 3. Thomas felt his careful restraint crumble as he looked at this remarkable woman who had somehow managed to turn tragedy into triumph, dependence into independence, and gratitude into something much deeper and more lasting. Elena Rodriguez, he said solemnly, will you marry me? Thomas Whitmore, she replied with a grin. I thought you'd never ask. 6 months later, they stood together in the parlor of Colonel Davis' ranch house, exchanging vows before a small gathering of friends and neighbors. Elena wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, and Thomas had traded his usual work clothes for a proper suit borrowed from the colonel. True to her word, Elena had used her land grant to claim the section adjacent to Thomas's old ranch, which they'd managed to buy back from Crane for exactly half what he'd paid for it. Together, their combined holdings stretched across nearly 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, with water rights, timber rights, and everything they needed to build the life they'd both dreamed of. The schoolhouse Elena built served families from miles around, and she quickly became known as one of the finest teachers in the territory. Thomas's cattle operation prospered under his careful management, and within 5 years they'd built one of the most successful ranches in the region. But their greatest success was the family they built together. Elena gave birth to 4 children over the next 8 years, 2 boys and 2 girls who inherited their mother's quick intelligence and their father's steady character. All 4 learned to read before they could properly saddle a horse, and all 4 could work cattle before they graduated from their mother's school. On quiet evenings when the children were in bed and the day's work was done, Thomas and Elena would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes they talked about the past, marveling at the chain of events that had brought them together. Sometimes they planned for the future, dreaming of the legacy they would leave their children. But most often they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, grateful for the miracle of a love that had grown from the ashes of tragedy into something stronger and more beautiful than either of them had ever dared to hope. Years later, when their children asked about how their parents had met, Elena would tell them the story of the auction in Bitter Creek, the sick mule, and the rancher who gave up his land deed for a stranger's freedom. Your father taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is the right thing, even when it costs you everything, she would say. And I taught him that sometimes what looks like an ending is really just a new beginning. Thomas would always add, with a twinkle in his eye, and the mule lived to be 23 years old and sired some of the finest mules in the territory. So it all worked out in the end. Their story became legend in those parts, a reminder that in a harsh and often unforgiving world, acts of pure kindness could still change everything. The deed of mercy that Thomas had performed that day in Bitter Creek had not only saved Elena's life, it had created a legacy of love, education and prosperity that would endure for generations. And sometimes, late at night when the wind was just right, travelers passing through the valley swore they could hear the sound of children's laughter echoing from the little schoolhouse on the hill, where Elena Whitmore continued to teach young minds that reading and writing and arithmetic were important, but that courage and compassion were the lessons that truly mattered most.